Excellent. Good evening, everybody. It's going to be a very light night because I don't have anything that anyone's asked me in the way of questions. But I've got some things to discuss. And Peter and I actually had a chinwag earlier on this afternoon. Again, for whatever reason, risk seems to be an ongoing and important issue in our profession. And it leaves us in a lot of quandaries. And we're looking at the question of, what is risk and how do we communicate it? And that's a difficult question. I had a group of 6 arborists that work at schools come around, or 8 arborists that work at schools come around and spend 4 hours here about 2 weeks ago. And we raised the same question, what is risk and how do you communicate it? And we pointed out last time around that there'd been a talk in Melbourne, and the Melbourne talk presented the concept that the member, that is the person making the decision, or the adjudicator, he was able to determine that trees were dangerous because they overhung the rear fence and overhung the roof of a house. And that just gives you an insight to how people see risk. And you'll see it everywhere. I was saying again to Peter, I was reading a judgment the other day, and it was a safety risk they were talking about. Well, I don't know what other sort of risk they were thinking of. Maybe the risk of winning lotto, but they didn't answer that, and so that that leaves this situation. So very important to keep in mind the different terminology that we use in risk, and use it consistently and precisely. So risk is the likelihood of some particular consequence. And that might be a positive or a negative consequence, but it's a likelihood. So you can't have a risk of a tree falling. You have a likelihood of a tree falling. And so it's important to keep in mind that the words matter. And the same with things like the tree is safe. And again, we're reading a judgment, and the inference of the judgment was the tree is safe. And the tree doesn't pose a risk. Well, of course, all trees pose some level of risk. And imposing a risk, the question is that risk acceptable or not? And trying to figure out how to deal with it. I just dealt with it recently in a school, and I just thought I'd share with you what was involved in that particular report. It was to do with bunya cones in an inner city school. We're about 25% of the canopy overhung the fence. As in the front yard of the school area where it was fully paved. So can we agree that bunya pines occasionally drop fruit? Can I get an agreement on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an annual thing. How many they drop and what's the condition they're in will vary from condition to condition, site to site, but they are going to drop cones. So there's not anything else but a certainty of that. So I decided I'd look at it quantitatively. And I worked out that the cones were going to fall at any time, so we really didn't have much opportunity to look at weather modification. Whilst there might have been, cones might fail more often during inclement weather, they still fall in normal weather. So the target was 3. The size of the part was 4. And the reason the size of the part's 4, even though a cone is about 200 and something rather millimeters in diameter, the size part is a mass issue. And so in the case of a cone, the weight of a 100 mil branch and the weight of a cone's actually lighter than average 100 mil branch. So it's the same equivalent response as a size part 4. And then the probability of failure was 1. And that resulted in a risk of harm of 1 in 50,000. So that's a fairly big risk. How do you deal with that? What do you think the way of processing that would be? Any thoughts?
Is it up? Is it as low as reasonably practicable?
Yeah, that's right. Is it ALARP? And the reason is it ALARP works particularly well for most places is that we have work health and safety legislation that says you don't have to get rid of every risk. It just has to be broadly acceptable or as low as reasonably practicable. It's in our legislation. The exception, unfortunately, for those of you who are from Victoria, Victoria doesn't have a piece of uniform legislation like that, as far as I know. They may have by now, but they certainly hadn't last time I checked. So you end up with this, is it as low as reasonably practicable? Well, normally when you're looking at a 100 mil dead branch, you'd say, well, look, it might cost me, well, let's say it's 1 in 50,000, it's a 100 mil dead branch or a 10 centimeter dead branch. If I cut that off now, I'm going to save the risk from the next year and the year after and the year after. I might amalgamate 10 years worth of risk up. And so if that's going to cost me $1,000, it's probably still affordable because I'm going to spread that over 10 years. Essentially, I'm spending the money now, but I'm getting the benefit for the next 10 years. And in fact, the risk is probably likely to increase slightly over the 10 years. So I'm definitely getting an advantage. But in the case of the bunya cones, they're going to fall every year. So what I did, and I'll just share the screen with you so you can see it. It'll be helpful for you. And so I did the assessment here, and then I work out the annualized cost of the risk. That's one of the things I do in my standard calculations because we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis. And that's one of the advantages of doing quantitative risk assessments, whether it's valid, whether it's QTRA, or whether it's a newfangled one that someone else is trying to figure out. If you can quantify risk, you can compare different risks against each other. So here, when considered against the value of statistical life, it equates to an annualized risk of about $110. So I've got $110 to get rid of the cones out of the tree. Can I ask, is anyone willing to get the cones out of the tree for that?
No.
Definitely not.
Definitely not. Okay. So here's the next question. Is it add up? So in determining what actions are reasonably practicable, it's important to consider the resources available. Well, it's a government department, so they've got crap loads of money, unlimited budget, not quite, but they've certainly got a little bit more than, you know, a jittery old lady might have. The likelihood of the level of risk will remain the same or increase over time. Well, it will remain static, thank goodness. It's just once a year there'll be a peak. And the enduring and cumulative benefits of the reduction over time. Well, there's no benefits because it's going to keep on happening. In this instance, the risk is related to an annual occurrence and therefore needs to be weighed against the annual cost of the risk. That is, risk mitigation would need to be somewhere around $110 a year. So we can say that the tree is LARP.
Mark, I thought that bunya pines tended to fruit more prolifically every 3 years.
Cyclically, yes. And so we don't know when that is, Peter. It's not reliable. It's like a good brachychiton flowering. Some years it's good, some years it's not. So some years the numbers are high. So I have a solution for that. And it was a solution that was given by a Sydney arborist who I thought was quite a clever solution. But let's have a look at it. The tree's canopy area is approximately 60 square metres, and based on the conversion of Kondo et al., according to Australian figures, this equates to about $670 in life-saving health benefits a year. Removal of the tree, therefore, would cause more harm than the risk that it would abate, and annual removal of the cones would be substantially more than $110. As a result, any option available to reduce the risk is likely to be grossly disproportionate. This means that the risk is as low as reasonably practicable, and thus the statutory requirements of the Work Health and Safety Act have been met. That said, if there are concerns about reputational risk management, and reputational risk management is simply saying, what would happen if the media played the game, essentially? There may be merit in considering removing the cones or annualized drone inspections followed by cone removal. The number of cones is high. So that answers your question, Peter. You know, what's the cone set like? And based on that cone set, should we be removing some cones or not? And of course, in a school, it's easy to say, but fortunately, most of the cones fall sometime between sort of late December, mid to late December to mid-February. So there's a portion of the time where the school's going to have comparatively few, but not none, because a lot of these schools also offer things like school holiday support for parents. I don't know what they call it. It used to be playgroup type things. But there, it gives you just an idea of how you can communicate some of those issues. So in that instance, as much as we don't need the cones on the tree, the cost of cutting the cones off would be disproportionate, and cutting down the tree would be cause significantly more harm than it would abate. So we accepted it. When you think about a 1 in 50,000 risk, that's about 2.5 times smaller than driving a car. So it's a
Mark,
yes.
could you speak to the proposition that if this is not a bunyip pine, this is I'm talking about particularly talking about gum trees. The proposition that if a gum tree drops branches, then it's more likely to drop branches in the future.
Yeah, look, this history of limb failure, or pattern of limb failure, as it's often talked about, isn't supported by literature in general. What we do have, and the ISA is pretty clear on this, is if you get a tree that's seeming to have a pattern, you need to determine the cause of the failure and then see if there are any other parts that are similar that have the same causal agents acting on them. So, you know, and it's interesting. I know we talked about this, and I'm assuming everyone found it, but there's been some work by a number of arborists recently looking at things like branch attachment, length of branch, angle of attachment, and clustering of branches. And there's no correlation between those issues. Sorry, there's no correlation between those issues and branch failure.
What about extended branch length?
Yeah, extended branch length's one that they looked at, and there was no correlation between that and branch failure in cyclonic weather.
And who studied that? Sorry,
Brian Kane was one of the authors, and I can't remember the others. But if you want, I'm happy to look it up for you. In fact, I'll do it now.
yes. I think it's an ongoing theme that one of the things that people tend to look at is that if a tree has dropped branches in the past, over the last 4 years, trees dropped 4 branches. So therefore, I can reasonably conclude that over the next number of years, it will continue to drop branches, that type of thing.
Yeah, look, and I can understand where people get that from, but you need to ask the other questions that go with it. Like, what was the cause of the failure? Was it a storm event? Did a storm event cause a number of limbs to partially fail? In which case, is that tree worse than the tree that actually dropped the branch, or is it better than the tree that dropped the branch? You know, the tree that lost all the branches at once may be, in fact, a higher risk, even though it's had just the one event. So the articles by Koza et al., Koza, Klein, Hauer, Meisbauer, Freeman, Harchick, and Kane, it's defective or just different. Observe storm failure in 4 urban tree growth patterns, and it's from forests. And let me just put it up on the screen, probably easier just for you so you don't have to write it all out. Let me share my screen. So this is the reference down here. I'll make it a bit bigger for you. And I'll get rid of that. So I'll make it even bigger for you. So that's it here down at the bottom. And it's actually one of my pet hates, Peter, because I go out to a school and I see the bottom 3 or 4 branches, which are quite often the longest 3 or 4 branches. And everyone wants to get rid of them, and so you see these trees just pruned up. And you're getting the end result is the opposite. You're actually increasing the risk rather than decreasing the risk.
Yeah, we saw an interesting presentation from
Ken James. Ken James,
of course, Ken James.
Yes.
And his story was quite compelling around that, I thought.
Yeah. It's quite compelling if you think about it in terms of a fishing rod. If I were to get a nice fishing rod, okay, how is that? Can people hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great.
We've got a workaround going on.
It's a patch, but it will get there. So where were we before I got ejected by the system?
Not entirely sure. Does anybody else remember?
We're looking at a fishing rod.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
A fishing rod. So a young sapling, and we all know this, you get a young sapling, you can bend it quite a way, 15 or 20 degrees. If you try that with a big tree, of course, if you grabbed it halfway down, you would snap it, you'd break it. And that's because the tree becomes more rigid the older it becomes. And you can do that as an experiment. You cut down a tree, you can take a section from near the pith, cut out a paddle pop stick, take a paddle pop stick from the outside edge, and compare the flexibility of the two. The one inside is more flexible, the one on the outside is more rigid. So now I take my fishing rod and I put a nice piece of 25 mil solid metal, and I gaff tape it all the way up along 4 foot of my 6 foot rod. So I've got still 2 foot of my rod, and it's the very flexible bit. Well, what happens when I do that?
Snap off.
It's going to snap where you finish taping it, because there's not an even movement all the way down. So when we change the way that the tree flexes, we actually increase the likelihood of parts failing. And Matt Wells talks about this in a wonderful little paper he did on the trees, and he looked at it. He said, the more you prune the trees, the more they fail. Now, in fairness, that was or is Santa Monica. Santa Monica's pruning is not the standard that we'd generally like, but the concept's the same. And that's this process of lines tailing or stripping things up. As you pull things out, what you're doing is you're making the bottom section more rigid and the top section stays equally as flexible, and then you get failure points. So it shouldn't surprise us at all. It's a basic material science issue.
I thought that Ken's explanation of mass damping was also interesting. I thought that explained a lot about why pruning branches made the trees more likely to fail.
It alters their mass damping, and it also makes the bottom part of the tree behave more like a static object, and the top side behave differently, like a dynamic object. And it's that conflict that creates the problem where the two interact. So you end up with parts failing. Mm. And I've often said, and I know I've said it certainly in class, Peter, with you, that, if you're going to do pruning work, small cuts are always far more preferable than big cuts. And I have a theory that the average size of your pruning cut is somewhat proportionate to the size of the part that will fail in the event you do get severe weather event. So if you were to go through and prune a tree and all that you use was a handsaw and cut out 10 mil branches, there's a reasonable likelihood that all that's going to fail is 10 mil parts, because that's where you've limited your change in motion between being static and being dynamic, is in that size part. Now, that's just a theory. In practice, I'm not sure how true that is, but I from my experience of guaranteeing my pruning work when I was doing practical arboriculture, that was pretty well true. So I'd far rather do lots of smaller cuts than a few bigger cuts any day. So in terms of, this process of lift pruning, crown modification,
one of the things I've started to do is tell people no crown modification for a period of time, and that might be 5 or 10 years, just to allow the tree to get time to adapt. And if you can think about it, if I've got a tree with a I don't know, 400, 500, 600 mil diameter trunk, reasonable young spotted gum, and I've removed branches that are 150 mils in diameter, I really have the next equivalent part in the tree's main structure and its vertical system. It's like that is probably the top 25% of the tree. So I've altered the tree significantly, and it will take conceivably 5 or 10 years before you'd even think about doing anything that was some form of crown modification. So, and it goes the other way too, and that's this process of pruning. The redundancy is taking little bits at a time rather than removing half the tree at a time. So, trying to encourage people to not deal with everything all at once. Shogo used to say, you know, if you went to a dentist, you had 4 fillings to do, 2 crowns, and 2 molars to be removed. The likelihood is the dentist wouldn't do that all at once. You know, it's 20 years worth of problems. It's going to take, you know, a few visits to get it sorted. And I think it's the same with trees. And we should value trees in much the same way as we value our teeth. Sorry to say, people. We should put some reasonable value on the fact that we do have them and they're great things. Any questions about that?
Can I ask, I've got a job at the moment where the council have come back and I've come in as the second arborist, and they want clear line of sight from a busy street into a site where they're going to be building a KFC. And I've been out to look at the trees and looked at what branches would need to be removed for every tree to give a clearance view from the street of 3 metres. They're Leuphostomans, and the maximum branches that would need to be removed are about 80 mils, I suppose, in diameter. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, that sounds fine. I mean, if I could, I'd look to see if there were smaller branches a little bit further out that allow me to achieve the same line of sight, remembering that your line of sight's not in the gutter. From a driver's perspective, your line of sight's 2 metres or more across in the lane.
Yeah, I took a measuring pole and set it up and then went across the street and looked and photographed and did all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, I mean, in a perfect world, you would stand on the back of a unit with your eye 3 metres in height. And
yeah.
That's in a perfect world. The answer is, you know, if you've got to prune things, you've got to prune things. We're not saying that we're so rigid about trees that we can't make life livable around them.
I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about pruning branches off trees and making the trees more likely to fail, it's more likely to fail, not that they will fail. It's not inevitable that they will fail. It just increases the likelihood. Yeah. And if the likelihood is low and you've increased it by an order of magnitude, it may still be low.
Yeah. And that's just nice mixing terms up, Peter. The risk is acceptable already. It may still be acceptable even after you've increased it. And a good example of that, and I'll just share one with you. Again, it's probably easier to show you. We'll open up a QTRA calculator. Screen a window. Let's see. It's having time, yep. So if I open up the QTRA calculator and we'll talk to a vehicle, that's what we're talking about. It's a reasonably heavily used road. We're talking and we're not really ever going to do this because we don't know what's going to fail as a result of what we do, but it'll still give you an idea. An average branch is going to be one in a million or close enough. Well, that's our cap risk is less than 1 in a million. If we uncap it, we open it up, that's 1 in 500 million. I could increase it once, twice, and it's only when I get to the third time that the probability of failure starts to. So I've increased the risk 1,000 times. That's a huge increase. That's an increase that I can't put my head around. I can't imagine that an increase that big. So I can see 10 times, 100 gets hard, 1,000 just starts to become very difficult. Or it becomes extremely obvious. So that would be cutting the branches on trees and cutting through the top third of the branch on each occasion. Something like that would be 1,000 times more likely to have the branch fail. Does that give you some concept? So it's absolutely right. It's a very small increase, often just an order of magnitude, because most trees pose a risk of harm that's, according to the Work Health and Safety Executive of the UK, 1 in 10 million or smaller. So the average tree is posing a risk of harm that's that small. It almost belies how we manage to do risk assessments for a living, but we do. So, talking of risk assessments for a living, seeing as no one had some questions, I had one for this block, and if I can, I'll go to my photos. Am I still sharing? No.
No.
It hates me, doesn't it? Yep, okay. Allow. Yep, there we are. So I went to a school the other day that somebody had looked at for me, and they said, look, there's cracking in the tree. There definitely was. It's an Acacia floribunda. And you can see here there's been some movement. And the first thing I noticed was these. Does anyone have any guesses?
Are they borer?
Yeah, borers. They're exit holes. And they're exit holes that are slightly flattened, slightly D-ish. So I knew that I was looking probably at some form of borer in particular. Anyone want to guess on that?
I know we've done it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's great. That's why we're doing it. Because I know that these things get done again. Sorry about the slightly out of focus. But this is a jewel beetle, Buprestidae. And Buprestidae are often a cause of problems. So the reason the bark was cracking is the wormwood underneath was growing very rapidly to try and fix things back up. And what we get here, you can see some concentric or crescent-shaped marks. And this is, again, confirmation that we've had jewel beetle. So jewel beetle have attempted to attack this tree on 2 occasions. It's not doing well. If I go and have a look at the other side, there's the other side of the tree. And so we've got 50% on one side, plus additional damage on the other side. Now, the interesting thing here was I'm a big hulk of a person, and I accept that. I got there and I saw this, and I tapped it with my hammer. I wanted to know more, so I tapped it with the hammer, and the bark was clearly drummy, so I knew the bark was loose, and so I knew there was some damage underneath. And I had to get that bark off to have a look. You can see the big plates of bark on the ground. Now, that can be hard to get off. I'm big enough to do that. Vicky, you may struggle to do that. And there are times when you need to use mechanical devices. I've got a soil knife, a hori knife, one of those wonderful tools that I use in consulting. And I've broken a couple of those in my day, so I was cautious. You know, a pry bar or a little mattock or something like that might have been useful. But I was able to get my fingers into a couple of spots and then slowly peel that away. And that gave me the image of what was happening underneath. You can see this is the other side. I've got some recent damage over here. And I was auditing another arborist, and my comment was the other arborist was right. The tree wasn't worth retaining. But it was the process of getting in there and finding out the reason behind. So it's one thing to say I'm concerned about the cracks. It's another thing to say I know why the cracks are there. So try to resolve things when you can. And here was another one that was interesting. Same audit process. There's a recording of a basal wound. Now, again, had I been really, really good, I would have pulled out my hori knife and exposed around here because there's something that's happening. But I do see occluding tissue, and my guesstimate is if I extrapolate that downwards, it's not going to be 1/3 of the diameter of the tree. Who would agree with that? Anyone?
Yep.
Yep. So I know that I could have a 1/3 cavity, a cavity with a 1/3 opening, and the tree's not going to be substantially less. So I would ignore something like that, for example, in a risk assessment, unless there was a requirement to record absolutely everything, in which case I'd get the angle right around and start grinding my teeth down because that would be more pleasurable for me. But some people out there love collecting data, and I admire that. I just can't do it myself. I haven't got the patience. So for me, that's a non-recordable thing, because what impact is that going to have on failure, probability of failure? And this is interesting. This is exactly what was asked in America. Peter, what sort of impact would that have, do you think?
Well, I can't remember the names that are given to the tracks. Probability of failure, but it's not likely to fail. It doesn't have a high probability of failure.
So it's possible or improbable?
Yeah, so it's, go along with that.
Yeah, so improbable is the first one. There's nothing that's really changed about the probability of failure. So if it's not probable that the tree would fail normally, then this hasn't altered that, so it's still improbable in my mind. And yet we saw in Brian Kane's presentation an example where crack arborists would say that has an imminent likelihood of failure. And it's interesting because the arborist picked this up and recorded it. And again, I would have walked past and not even looked a second time. I would have wanted to see a lot more harm in a tree in order to act. So what sort of harm would that be? Let me see if I can find one. This is an interesting one. This is the branch has been cut off. Ignore the back cut. There's cockatoo damage there. You can see the cavity. Everyone see that?
Yeah.
I wrote the report for that today. Sean Talent, great arborist, had a look at that and suggested the removal of the branch. Now, again, we wouldn't do that anymore. Our recommendation would be a reduction of that branch, and that would be it. And never like that. If we had to do anything, we'd want to bring it back out and have it as a longer perch if we're going to leave it as a dead branch. Because we want the cavity to be used. We want the cavity to be used appropriately. So keeping perches underneath or adjacent to the cavity is useful. But that tree was first recorded in 2017 as having a cavity, and it'll probably be still sitting there quite happily in another 30 or 40 or 50 years' time. And again, that's outside the office block of a school, and I simply made a note of it, said it needs just to be inspected on a regular basis. It's producing some adaptive growth. You can see it's slightly thicker here. So I know there's some decay going on, but the tree's healthy and it's dealing with it. There's no reason to suspect that it will fail just because of that. On the other hand, I saw that and I thought, oh, I can see, I'm going to give it to you, purse lips. I'll go to the other side. You'll see purse lips on the other side, definitely, which is here. See the lips coming in, and there's actually an active crack down to here. And so I looked at that and I said, well, how likely is that to fail? The answer was, I'm pretty sure that it's still in the tolerable range, or certainly in the, possibly in even the broadly acceptable range.
Sorry, what was that, Mark? Are you talking about the likelihood of failure or the risk of harm?
The risk of failure. It's a good question, Peter. As a tree, I've definitely got cracking down here, and the other image is not so clear. There's some reaction wood, and there's a little bit of a pursed lips coming in here, and I don't know why it's.
So it's more likely to fail than an say ordinary tree, and
Yeah.
is it an order of magnitude more likely, or 2 orders of magnitude more likely?
Well, let's great question again, Peter. Let's assume that it's either. And this is where we start to look at it's a school zone. I'm going to put the target zone for people as 3, weather modified to 4. Size of part, I think we can say 3, 250 mils in diameter. And then if I've got 4, the likelihood of the risk of harm comes down to 1 in a million. If I select 3, the risk of harm comes down to 1 in a million. And so you could go 1, 2, 3 orders of magnitude and still have a range of fat. If we went down to probability of failure 2, that means somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100. And that's already been there like that for probably 2 or 3 years by the looks of the wound wood on it.
I would say, though, that looking at that photo, that a probability of failure of range 2 is be a bridge too far.
Oh, absolutely. But even at that level, we get back to having $10 to do the work, over 10 years, $100, and I'm just not sure who would want to remove that tree or the $100 fee. I'm guessing nobody.
Nobody.
We're down the stage where, again, the risk is as low as reasonably practicable. So, again, there's nothing wrong with having a tree with a risk of 1 in 500,000 or 1 in 50,000, provided that there's a benefit. So it's not a tree that I've recommended for removal, but I understand different parties would want to behave differently. In my view, again, this tree doesn't pose an unacceptable risk. So from my side, I couldn't authorise its removal under the SEP, and the school would need to apply to the council for consent to remove that tree if that's what the school wanted to do. I'm not there as their manager. I'm there to give them information about the risk. And so I've told them they can go to the council, but I can't authorise it under the SEP. The SEP says the tree has to pose a risk, and by that risk, I don't mean, and I don't think the Act means, or the SEP means, any form of risk. It means a risk that is not of the sort that we would generally find acceptable. So does that help?
Yep.
And what that means, if you start putting that stuff that I was just talking about in place, it means that theoretically, once you've seen the tree, so from this position here and this position here, you don't have to see every little minutiae on the other side. You don't need to see every minor bit. It doesn't make any difference to the risk, because nothing that small is going to increase the risk many-fold. So what you're doing essentially in the ISA tree-risk manual talks about it is often when you're looking at trees, you're not going to assess every tree in detail or even look at every tree in detail. You're walking around trying to find trees that you need to do a more detailed assessment of. And so from a cost effectiveness, good risk assessment need not mean assessing every tree in detail. Quite frequently, I mean just looking for things that are little checks to say, oh, need to look more, need to look more. Does that help?
Yep.
The same thing applies to, when you're looking at a tree in a house, most householders aren't out during storms, so it's a weather modified area. Same principles apply. don't need to think about every little minutia. You need to be looking for big things. And I think David Evans' one pager of, I won't use the phrase, but obvious tree defects or obvious risk
Features, is it?
features, obvious risk features is what I use. It's available. I include it in every school report, and I'm at the stage where I'm slowly tempted to print them up as an A2 poster, laminate them and give them to schools just to say, look, these are the things you need to be looking out for. Because there's nothing more annoying than having someone call you and say, the tree dropped a branch, and you get there and it's a branch that's, 5 centimetres in diameter, and you think, yep, I really didn't need to come and have a look at that. So that might be something that you people think about over time.
Especially if they describe it as a large branch.
It could have killed them. And I had troubles in the early days with branches, and I'm not going to suggest otherwise. I remember we used to do a thing called fine pruning, and that was taking out stuff 1 centimetre in diameter and greater. And from an aesthetic point of view, if you're doing a brush box, it looks spectacular. But it's not a risk management activity. It's just purely a way of getting more money out of a client. And if they've got a show garden, that might be fine. If they haven't, then the question is, why 5 centimetres or 10 centimetres? There's got to be some limit. There is a death that we have in our records from America of a person who was killed with a 4-inch branch. That's same as 10 centimetres. So we know that a falling branch of that size could kill somebody or can kill somebody. At 5 centimetres, I have another problem, and that is I used to do tree work. And every now and again, we had a very loud chipper. The guys would get distracted by things, and you'd want to get their attention, and you couldn't. You'd want to say, I'm ready to lower the next bit or whatever. And so you'd cut off a branch. And it wasn't infrequent that it was something that was hand size, so 5 to 6 or 7 centimetres in diameter. You'd cut that branch off, and you would throw it at the guys. And more than once, you'd inadvertently hit them. And when I talk to other arborists that have been doing tree work, quite a number of them smile and say, yes, I have done the same thing at some stage or other, and often more than once. There's no dead bodies out there.
Although I can say that I'm glad I didn't ever work in your tree crew. No.
I'm sure there's a lot of people who would have said the same thing, but nonetheless, it's still a common practice that the arborist in the tree to try and get attention will throw things at the guys on the ground, including branches. And in spite of that, there aren't dead people out there. So a 5 centimetre branch could kill you, but you'd have to be really seriously unlucky, I think, to get that happen. And I say that I wasn't ever even able to do a dent in a hard hat from doing that. So I'm sure it would take a fair bit. Now, I have been hit by a 5 centimetre diameter dead branch and given, I think it was 5 or 6 stitches, but I can live with 5 or 6 stitches. If we looked at 5 or 6 stitches, where would that be in the consequence? Would that be extreme, severe, or significant, or minor? Where do you think that would fit?
My guess is that it'd be minor.
Yeah, I think it's minor.
Yeah, almost negligible, but not quite, I think.
I think stitches puts it above. It's not a band-aid, it's stitches.
Yeah, but it's 6 or 7 stitches, $300 worth of medical care, and 3 or 4 days off work. I guess that's what $1,200, $1,500 in today's language. It's not horrendous. But yes, it's somewhere down that. So to sit there and think that a 5 centimetre dead branch is going to kill somebody. Now, I will modify that or qualify that. If that was over a seated area in a primary school where the kids sat down and had lunch, I might take a different view of that. But in general, where people are mobile,
I think that the important point here, though, is that if it's a primary school with a seated area, you're not looking for dead people. You're looking for those negligible to minor injuries that, even though in the scheme of things it's not massive, it's still something the school wouldn't want to have occur if it could be easily prevented.
Yeah, that's right. It goes down to that reputational
Yeah.
risk. Whilst the risk might be acceptable, it's easier to address the problem than it is to deal with the media, should the media want to make an issue of it.
Mm.
And there are media personalities, and I won't mention Ben Fordham, you can keep that in there. Ben's got a whole page dedicated to why trees shouldn't be around the place at all. And he got to the stage where he suggested that we probably shouldn't have trees within a kilometre of a school. But I think that's probably the wrong priority. For the great benefit that trees give to students, the small level of risk means we should probably have more trees. And I think the biggest risk factor we face in schools is a lack of trees, not the risk associated with trees. So if I had my way, we'd fly schools by LiDAR, we'd find out where we could plant trees, and we'd spend all the money we're spending on risk assessments on tree planting. And we wouldn't plant silly trees. By silly trees, for me, that's Grandis in the western suburbs of Sydney, Eucalyptus saligna in the western suburbs of Sydney, Microcorys in most schools in Sydney. Eucalyptus microcorys is just a problematic tree, fast growing, lots of dead wood produced, as opposed to something that's slower growing. Will still produce dead branches, but require a lot less maintenance. So bigger, faster growing trees will require, by virtue of their size, more maintenance. And microcorys does not compete well during drought, so it's not an ideal species. I think there's a lot better choice. Eucalyptus nicolai, I think we've done the days of nicolai now. Scaparia is not as bad, but almost. So I think, we whack those few trees out and not plant them in future. They're fine when they're there. But I think beyond that, we could do well. If you haven't ever seen it, you can write to Peter and ask him if we can do it, and I'll pull up the images. But Pterocornis, Mollicana, Casuarina glauca will all out-compete tallow woods when there's a drought, and they'll out-compete them to the point of killing them. It's fascinating to see.
Mark, my experience of microcorys around here is that they prefer a very specific soil type, and sort of geography. So if it's too steep or on the southern side of the hill and so forth, if you look at where they occur naturally, it's really, really specific. I wonder if it's the fact that they don't really like that Sydney soil as much.
Heavy clays, I don't think are so much the problem. It's that for whatever reason, Pterocornis grows in a far broader range, Mollicana a far broader range of soil plumbers. So when the soil gets dry, when the available moisture drops down, Mollicana and Pterocornis are far better at extracting that last of that water. And I've got images of a whole park where nearly every tallowood died almost within a month of each other from this over competition. And it really is fascinating to see. And, I see it as I go around schools, western suburbs of Sydney, where rainfall's sitting at 800 or 900 mils, with trees that grow best in rainfalls of 1,500 plus mils. They just don't seem to perform as well. That's the same as Grandis, beautiful tree, grows well when it's young. By the time it gets to sort of that 35 or 40 year mark, I'm starting to find big dead sections of bits die back. It stresses down more during extremes than something that's well adapted to it. If you do the same thing with a Gajaya, a Wilga, it would just laugh and say, well, what was that? So I think we whilst microcoriza is very tolerant of having concrete over the roots and compaction, it doesn't do well with dry. So for me, it's one that, you know, for 50% or so of the schools, anything that's sort of past Parramatta, it starts to drop down. And yet, and I was saying to Peter earlier on today, I was at a school, and I'll happily name the school, Dobroyd Point Public School. I've got their 3-foot high fence around it. That's just such a rarity in a school. Nearly every tree had been pruned, no large dead branches in anything, well maintained. As you get to the front gate, there's a 1.47 metre diameter spotted gum at the front gate. And, you know, seeing something like that in a school, it's just so breathtaking. They've got guava in the school. They've got a couple of mandarins with 30+ centimetre diameter trunks. There's big trees in the school, and it's just a totally different atmosphere. So if you get a chance to drive past it, the gates are open. There's no locking of them in that end of the world. So on a weekend, you can have a sneak round, have a look at Dobroyd Point Public School. What a great thing. I went for another one in Newtown the other day, Peter, just talking of great trees in schools, and there was a ficus rubiginosa, and someone had the brains to let the aerial roots hit the ground. They're actually cultivating it. In fact, I'll show you the image. It's just too good not to show. If I can. Screen photos, yes. Allow, yes. Back. Down. Also, just quickly opens them up. And here it is. Somebody who got along, and just as the simplest of solutions, grab 2 rings of mesh, fill them with mulch, and let roots get into them. And what you're seeing here, this little line, zoom in, that's a fig root. Once that root hits the ground, the rate of growth and thickening of that root is phenomenal. It's disproportionate. And so they have set up over their play area 2 props out of those aerial roots that are sitting down. That'll add strength to the point of stupidity. It's just amazing. That's, you know, that limb will not fail under all likelihood at all now. So again, it shows you what happens when people just take a different view of trees and see them as valuable. I met with the principal of that school. She came and hunted me down and wanted to talk about other bits and pieces that were happening in the school. But we talked about the building of the prop bridge, and she said it's her absolute favourite place in the school. And I know that once that wire meshes off and they start to get the next lot of props to develop, that'll become just a brilliant area for play for the children. You know, it's just a different approach than what we're used to, and I think that's great. Again, if you haven't seen it, Wentworth Park in Sydney, just on the southern side of the actual racetrack area itself, there is a Moreton Bay fig that has just curtain roots everywhere. It's just spectacular. Those of you who aren't in Sydney, I apologise. But they're great trees. Any other questions, guys? We're out of time. We've done our hour.
No, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Guys. By the way, great to see you here.